Hey GMATers, I'm back with another interesting concept and challenge. Have you ever struggled with identifying dependent clauses and their roles in sentences? Did you know that dependent clauses can behave as subjects, objects, noun modifiers, and even action modifiers within sentences? Well, if you did not, then you've come to the right place. In this video, I'm going to discuss the various roles of dependent clauses, not just from a grammatical perspective, but from a meaning standpoint. And then we are going to discuss two very hard official SC questions that test us on the roles of dependent clauses. So without further ado, let's start by taking a look at one such difficult question. Here you have it on your screen. Please pause this video and give this question a fair attempt so that there are no spoilers along the way. Alright, assuming that you have solved this question, let's take a look at the statistics. As you can see, the correct answer is B. Only 30% managed to get this question right, and a whopping 36% settle for answer choice A, and the remaining for C, D, and E. Now, if you've seen these answer choices closely, you would have realized that the game is all about the roles of dependent clauses. So without further ado, let's get cracking by understanding dependent clauses. Now, before I dive into the roles and functions of dependent clauses, let me give you a quick refresher. What is a clause? Well, a clause is a group of words that contains a subject and a verb, and this group of words is found within a larger sentence. We know that clauses can be of two types, independent clauses and dependent clauses. Independent clauses can stand on their own, they make complete sense. However, dependent clauses cannot stand on their own, right? And they make incomplete sense. They depend on the clause that they are a part of, the sentence that they are a part of, in order to make complete sense. So most of us are aware of these basic definitions, yet we falter in questions on dependent clauses. So why is that? Well, it's because just this level of understanding is not sufficient to crack questions, especially hard questions on the GMAT. Now, many of us go a level deeper, right? And we realize that in order to connect two independent clauses, we need to use a fanboys, one of those 7 coordinating conjunctions: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And dependent clauses are not connected to sentences with the help of fanboys. I think most of us know this. So which connectors are used? Well, you can use the principle of exclusion. Any other connector other than the fanboys can connect a dependent clause to the rest of the sentence. So this was level 1, but even such an understanding sometimes does not suffice, especially in the question that we just saw. So now we're going to go another level deeper into our understanding. And let's start by understanding, first of all, the roles of dependent clauses within bigger sentences, and then also look at the connectors that connect each of these different types of dependent clauses based on their roles. Let's start by taking a look at the first role of a dependent clause, and that is as a noun modifier. All right, let's look at a very simple example. The man who won the award is my uncle. All right, so if we quickly apply sentence structure analysis, we see that we're talking about a man, and we have a group of words here that describes the man who won the award, and then we have the verb for the man is my uncle. So if I were to use, bullet points here, this is how our sentence structure would develop. The man who won the award is my uncle. So we have the subject, the man, and we have the verb is. So the question at hand is, what is this group of words doing in this sentence? Well, it's clear what it's doing. It's describing the man. It's telling us which particular man we're talking about. But what's more interesting is that this group of words contains a subject and a verb. The subject is a relative pronoun, who. As you know, relative pronouns can behave as both connectors and nouns, either subjects or objects of relative clauses. Here we have a relative clause who, not only joining this clause to the man, but also behaving as the subject of the verb one. So here we have a clause that behaves as a noun modifier. You see how simple it was? Let's take a look at a second example. And this time we're looking at an official example. A very popular question. We've even covered this in one of our earlier videos. The tracks that dinosaurs left show that they walked with their feet directly under their bodies, as do mammals and birds, not extended out to the side in the manner of modern reptiles. Okay, so there's a lot going on here. I'm not going to, get into every, bit and piece of information in the sentence. I'm going to try to single out the noun modifying clause. See if you can, cut ahead and spot it before I get there. All right, so the tracks that dinosaurs left show that they walked. Okay, so I can see that this part can be brought on. Let me bring this down a little bit here. We're talking about tracks. Which tracks? The tracks that dinosaurs left. Interesting. Okay, what about these tracks? They show us something. These tracks show that the dinosaurs walked with their feet directly under their bodies, as do, okay, so I'm just going to leave this here, right? We're not going to bother about the remaining sentence because it's going to take a long time, but we already have what we are looking for. And let me highlight that for you over here. Before that, let me just add the bullet points. Right? So we have this, we have here, and we have one here. Okay, the tracks. Which tracks? That dinosaurs left. So we have this group of words modifying particular tracks. Interesting. And then we have show, which is the verb of the subject tracks. Do you see that? But this group of words here behaves as a modifier of the noun tracks. The question at hand is this a clause? Well, let's dive in. That, yes, is a relative pronoun, and this group of words has a subject and a verb. Interesting. So this does qualify as a clause. It does have a subject and a verb. It does have a connector in the form of a relative pronoun. Well, then you might be wondering, if this is a relative pronoun, why is it not the subject of the verb in the clause? Well, that's because relative pronouns can also behave as objects within relative clauses. For example, here, this that replaces tracks, and tracks is actually the missing object of the verb left. Dinosaurs left tracks. The tracks that dinosaurs left. All right, so this is basics of sentence structure analysis. If you need me to cover this in more detail, do leave your suggestion in the comments, and I will record a separate video on how to identify the various roles of relative pronouns within dependent clauses. But for now, let's move forward. Clearly, we're dealing with a relative clause or a dependent clause behaving as a noun modifier. You see how that works, guys? As simple as that. Now, an important piece of information, something that might be on your mind right now. How do we identify such clauses? What are the kind of connectors that such clauses begin with? So I'm going to write that down over here. Okay, let me just adjust my marker for a second there. Okay, so I'm going to change this. All right, let's start. So the connectors that we find for noun modifiers are, and I'm going to use blue. All right. There are only 10, okay? You need to keep these 10 in mind. Who, whom, whose, which, what, that, when, where, why, and how. Please make a note of these. These are the magical 10 connectors that we typically find at the start of dependent clauses that behave as noun modifiers. All right, so I'm going to put an important sign over here. Please make it a point to, memorize these. How do you do it? Well, just say them out loud. Say it with me once. Who, whom, whose, which, what, that, when, where, why, how. Say this 5 times and trust me, this is going to stick to your tongue like glue. All right, now let's move on to the second function of a dependent clause, and that is as an action modifier. So here you have some examples on your screen. Let's start with a very simple example. He left early because he wasn't having a good time. Okay, so as you can see, this group of words here modifies the first group of words. Let me quickly get those bullet points here. All right, now he left early. Why did he leave early? Let's try to understand the role of this group of words. This group of words is telling me why he left. In other words, this group of words modifies the verb or is an action modifier. Now let's look at the constitution. We see that there is a subject and a verb, and we also have a connector. Now, at this stage, you might not know what kind of connector because is, but if you remember the rule of exclusion, if it is not in the fanboys, then it has to be a dependent clause connector, and that's exactly what because is. Let's take a look at an official example now. Okay, so this is slightly more complicated, bear with me. Before scientists learned how to synthesize the growth hormone, it had to be painstakingly removed in small amounts from the pituitary glands of human cadavers. What are cadavers? Dead bodies, all right? So before scientists learned how to synthesize the growth hormone, it had to be removed from the pituitary glands of human cadavers. Interesting idea, right, to say the least. But let's look at the structure now, and let's quickly do our sentence structure analysis. Let me first get this out of the way. Okay, let's bring this down here. Okay, so before scientists learned something, what did they learn? How to synthesize the growth hormone. We have the main idea here. It had to be painstakingly removed from pituitary glands. Okay, of human cadavers. Okay, so there we have our simple indented structure. Let me show you the bullet points here. Now let's understand what's going on here. We see that there is a subject verb pair in the first group, which starts with a connector before, and before is not in the fanboy. So by the principle of exclusion, this has to be a dependent clause connector. Okay, before the scientists learned something, what did they learn? How to synthesize the growth hormone. So we see that this group of words ends over here. So this entire thing from before to hormone is a dependent clause. I hope you're all able to at least spot this. If not, then please make sure you put in a good amount of practice. Then we come to the independent clause. It, subject, had to be removed. Passive verb. It, subject, had to be verb, removed in small amounts from the pituitary glands of human cadavers. So as you can see, we have the independent clause over here, IC, and we have the dependent clause over here, TC. Wasn't that easy? Okay, so now we come to the million-dollar question. Can you tell me, can you think, what is the role from a meaning perspective of this clause? What does it tell us? Before. Take a clue from the word before. It hints of time. Time of what? Okay, time of the action in the main clause. For example, if I were to ask you a question, when did scientists remove growth hormone, or the growth hormone, painstakingly from the pituitary glands of human cadavers? When? Well, the answer is before they learned how to synthesize it in the lab. You see how this tells us the time of this passive verb. Once again, we have an action modifier on our hands. You see how easy that is? Okay, so the next question, which you're wondering right about now, is what about the connectors? Right? Which connectors, dependent clause connectors, are used to make such clauses, dependent clauses, that behave as action modifiers? Well, in simplest words, again, we're going to use the principle of exclusion, and the answer is all other dependent clause connectors, DC connectors, by exclusion. Okay, other than what? Other than the ones that we just saw, the 10 that we just saw that make noun modifiers. All right, let's move ahead. Now we come to the third and final function of dependent clauses, and that is as subjects or objects within clauses, okay, within bigger sentences. For example, let's start with simpler examples. Mr. Fuller believes that there is life after death. Interesting, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit over here. Okay, so Mr. Fuller, we can see that the subject is Mr. Fuller and he believes something. There is an object of the verb believes. What does Mr. Fuller believe? Does he believe life? Does he believe death? Does he believe that? He believes that there is life after death. Mr. Fuller believes something. What? That there is life after death. This group of words behaves as the object of the verb believes. Do you see it? I'm pretty sure you do. Now, what kind of group of words is this? Can we call it a clause? Let's check. Is there a connector? Is there a subject? Is there a verb? Yes. It's slightly atypical of a clause, but it is a clause. Why? Because I can see a verb. Do you all see the verb with me? Is? Yes. Very good. The next $1,000,000 question. Do you see the subject? Can you put your finger on the subject? Is it there? Is there the subject? The answer is no. If you marked there, please note there is a modifier. This is a case where the subject actually appears after the verb. Life after death is there. Do you see that this clause has been written in reverse? And extra bonus points to anyone who guesses what do we call a clause in which the verb appears before the subject? Ding, ding, ding. An inverted clause. Does that ring a bell? I hope it does. If it does not, please let me know whether you would like me to record a separate video on inversions. I'd be happy to oblige. All right, let me know in the comments. Anyway, getting back to this, so we do have a verb, we do have a subject, and we do have that, not as a relative pronoun, mind you, as a DC connector. That's it. This becomes a dependent clause. We're sorted. What does it do? Does it modify Mr. Fuller? No. Does it modify believes? Does it tell me the time of believing, the reason, the manner, or any other such thing? Of course not. It tells me what Mr. Fuller believes. You see, it answers the question what. That means it's an object. A dependent clause has an object. All right, let's look at another example. What confuses most people is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. Okay, interesting. So something is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. What confuses most people is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. Something is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. Or if we flip it around, because that's what we can normally do when we deal with a verb like is, we can just flip the sentence around and say the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary is something, or something is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. You with me? Now, what is the sudden? People? What? Am I asking a question? No. I'm saying the thing that confuses most people. There is something, and that thing confuses most people. What confuses most people? This entire entity, the thing that confuses most people is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. So as you can see, this group of words behaves as the subject of the verb is. Isn't that interesting? I know this is a little tricky, it's a little challenging, it's not as easy as I'm making it look, I admit. So that only means you need to put in an extra amount of practice. Okay guys, don't shy away, don't cow away, right? Now, what confuses most people? Can we call this a clause? Is this a dependent clause? Well, we see there is a verb, we see there is an object. That leaves us with what? Can we call this a subject? Yes, we can. Is it a relative pronoun? Yes, it is. It is a relative pronoun behaving as the subject of the verb confuses. So we have subject, verb, object with a connector, what itself, and this clause behaves as the subject of the verb is. In other words, a dependent clause behaving as a subject. Wasn't that fascinating? All right, you must be wondering about the connectors. Same as the ones used for noun modifier DCs. Remember those magical 10? I'm going to write this here. Those magical 10. Come on, repeat after me. Who, whom, whose, which, what, that, when, where, why, how. Say this 5 more times and I promise you're never going to forget them again, right? Just as you never forgot the fanboys, just remember these the same way, make a mnemonic out of it if you can, right? So the very same connectors that we use, to create clauses, dependent clauses that behave as noun modifiers, the very same connectors are used to make clauses that behave as subjects and objects. And if you take any other clause with any other connector other than these 10, right, any of the other DC connectors, then it would automatically be an action modifying clause. All right, so this is a bit of a grammar tip, right, if in case you're looking for it. But guys, remember, if you rely on meaning analysis, you will never ever need such grammatical shortcuts, right? So I always come back to the central point, which is the central theme, which is rely on meaning analysis. Okay, so something is the sudden disappearance. What is that something? What confuses most people is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. Isn't that simple, guys? Okay, now one important hack, one important trick here that I would leave you with is that if you ever look at a clause that behaves as a subject or an object, if you want to check whether it behaves as a subject, just see whether it behaves as an object or vice versa. Because if a clause can behave as a subject, it can also behave as an object. For example, Mr. Fuller believes that there is life after death. If this is an object, I should also be able to make it a subject. That there is life after death is no secret. You see how that works? As simple as that. What confuses most people is the sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary. Let's try to make this an object. The sudden disappearance of the foreign secretary is what confuses most people. So you can put it on the right side of the verb as well, right? Point being, any clause that can behave as a subject can also behave as an object. So a quick check is to see if you're not able to figure out, a subject role, try to create an object role and then draw the parallels. I hope that helps. Okay. Now let's get down to an official example very quickly. Canadian scientists have calculated that every 9 years a human being will be struck by a meteorite, while each year 16 buildings can be expected to sustain damage from such objects. So another interesting sentence with a bit of a contrast going on, about the frequency of sustaining damage from a meteorite, you know. So there's a kind of a contrast between how frequently a human being will sustain such damage and a building would sustain such damage. So that's as far as the meaning is concerned, but let's just do a bit of sentence structure analysis also, right? So let's bring this down a little bit. Scientists have calculated something. What have they calculated? Well, there you have it. As simple as that. Canadian scientists have calculated that every 9 years, okay? Now, first let's analyze this group of words. It starts with a that. It has a passive verb will be struck. It has a subject, a human being, okay? And it has the connector, the DC connector, that. Can we call this a clause, everyone? Absolutely yes. Can we call it a dependent clause? Absolutely yes. So this dependent clause behaves or is connected to the preceding verb. But in what way? Is it a modifier of calculated or is it the object? Let's check. Canadian scientists have calculated something. What have they calculated? You see, the question here is what? What have they calculated? Canadian scientists have calculated that every 9 years a human being will be struck by a meteorite. This is the object of the verb calculated. So we have a dependent clause behaving as an object. You see how it works? All right. Now let's take a slightly more advanced official example, and I'm going to get these out of the way so that we have more space. Let's dive in. Now this is a pretty intimidating sentence, so let's zoom out a little bit. Don't get scared now. Let's start with sentence structure analysis. Why cheddar cheese should inhibit tooth decay? Okay, so this looks like a dependent clause, right? It has the makings of one. Is unclear. So something is unclear. Why cheddar cheese should inhibit tooth decay is unclear. Okay, but comma plus fanboys, Dr. Bowen, and then we have another clause here, who reports this effect in her study, speculates. So we have the verb here for Dr. Bowen. What does she speculate? She speculates that the food might interfere with the acid. Okay, which acid? The acid that decays teeth, or with the bacterium that produces the acid. Wow, that was quite a mouthful. I hope you were able to do this as easily as I have. Right, let's quickly put our bullet points. Okay, so let's start doing our meaning analysis. So something is unclear. What is that something? Why cheddar cheese should inhibit tooth decay? Okay, so we have should inhibit, a verb. We have the subject cheddar cheese, and then we have why, which I told you is a DC connector, and this is found in that list of 10 DC connectors: who, whom, whose, which, what, that, when, where, why, how. So we can use why to create either a noun modifier clause or a clause that behaves as a subject or an object. So clearly we have a clause here on our hands that is perfectly capable of behaving as the subject of the subject of the verb is. Beg your pardon there. So this is the subject for the verb is clear. So we have a noun clause or a dependent clause behaving as a noun or a subject. But Dr. Owen, who reports this effect in her study? Again, we have one of those 10 DC connectors, right? Who, and this modifies Dr. Bowen. So this is again a noun modifier dependent clause, the thing we studied right at the start. Dr. Bowen, subject, verb, speculates something, that the food might interfere with the acid or with the bacterium. Okay, so as you can see from here to here, we have again a relative clause with a subject and a verb, a dependent clause behaving as the object of the verb speculates. So this is a noun clause or a dependent clause as a noun, which behaves as the object of the verb speculates. So here we had a clause behaving as the subject. Here we have a clause behaving as the object. Do you all see it? Okay, there's something more. That the food might interfere with the acid that decays tea. Here we have a relative pronoun clause modifying acid. So we have a noun modifier. Or with the bacterium that produces the acid, another relative clause modifier describing the noun bacterium, so another noun modifier. So in total we had one dependent clause as the subject, one dependent clause as an object, and then we had three noun modifier clauses. 1, 2, 3. Wow, wasn't that interesting? And doesn't knowing this make the sentence all the more comprehensible and meaningful? I hope you agree with me on that. All right, so there you have it, everybody. These were the three functions of dependent clauses as noun modifiers, action modifiers, and subjects and objects. We're finally ready to go back to our original official question and see what was the matter with that question. Why is it that only 30% of the test takers managed to get this question correct? All right, so let's quickly start with sentence structure analysis. So just because King Alfred occupied and fortified London in 886 did not mean, all right, very interesting, did not mean is a verb, did not mean something, all right. The invading Danes were well aware of this weakness and used it to their advantage. See how easy that was, right? Let's quickly get our bullet points here. And let's apply everything that we have learned so far. Something did not mean something. So we have one DC here and we have another DC here on either side of a verb. Do you all see that? Okay, now the easier one to identify here is this DC, which behaves as the object of mean. Did not mean something. Did not mean what? Did not mean that he also won, the loyalty of its citizens. But let's focus on the subject. Can this behave as the subject of this verb did not mean? First of all, it has to be a DC. Is it a DC? King Alfred, subject, occupied and fortified London because DC connector. So we definitely have a DC, but the question is this DC capable of behaving as a subject? Where does the money lie? The money lies in identifying this connector. Now, you remember those 10 magical connectors that we talked about? Again, repeat. Who, whom, whose, which, what, that, when, where, why, how. Do we have because in this list? Absolutely not. Because is always used, even from a meaning perspective, to tell us the reason behind an action. It never tells us, a subject or an object of an action. So we have one error identified here. Anything else here? Well, at least not from the perspective of errors. Do we have any other clauses? Well, we have one more clause here. The invading Danes were well aware of this weakness and used it. So we have two verbs here, were and used, for the subject Danes in a separate clause. But the main issue at hand in this original sentence is that this DC cannot behave as the subject of the verb did not mean. And that is why answer choice A cannot be the answer. It can never, ever, ever be the answer. Now let's look at answer choice B. Do we have something that can function as a subject of the verb did not mean? Something did not mean, what? The fact that King Alfred had occupied and fortified London in 886 did not mean. Can we call this the subject? The answer is yes, because this behaves as a noun. We have a noun followed by a dependent clause that tells us what that fact is. So this entire phrase is capable of behaving as the subject of the verb did not mean. So this one is clearly correct. What about the other answer choices? Okay, let's look at C and E. Both have the same error. We have a pronoun it with nothing to refer to. And as you know, on the GMAT, a pronoun cannot refer to a clause. C and E go out the window. This is why there were so few takers for C and E, because a lot of people seem to already know this. And the last one, D, has a sentence fragment. The fact that King Alfred occupied and fortified London in 886, comma, it did not mean. Do you see this extra it? If it is the subject, then what is this phrase doing in the sentence? Nothing. We need to remove the it and we need to make this phrase the subject of the verb did not mean. And that's why D does not even make a sentence. Well, there you have it, the complete discussion of this question. Let's quickly summarize the takeaways from our session very, very quickly. Today we discussed the roles of dependent clauses. We saw that dependent clauses can behave as noun modifiers, they can behave as action modifiers, they can even behave as subjects and objects, right? Dependent clauses are joined by dependent clause connectors, which are all connectors excluding the fanboys. Fanboy stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, so. But then we went a level deeper into the concept and we understood that noun modifier DCs and DCs that behave as subjects and objects are connected with 10 typical DC connectors, which are, very quickly, when, where, why, how, who, whom, whose, which, what, and that. Remember these 10, write it down somewhere, say it a few times till you're able to memorize them. Then we looked at a framework. Always ask yourself, what is the DC doing in the sentence, right? Is it modifying a noun? Is it modifying an action? Is it doing the verb? Is it suffering the verb as an object? Ask yourself this question consciously. And if you're ever confused whether a clause can behave as a subject, well, try to use it as an object. If it can behave as an object, it can also behave as a subject, and vice versa. All right, so I'm going to leave you with a challenge. This is another hard question which will test you on this particular concept. That's my time. My name is Abhishek Raj. I enjoyed bringing this to you. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I hope you found it useful. And if you'd like me to publish more of such content, then please do let me know what you thought about this video in the comments. Also, please send in your answers to this challenge. You can type it out in the comments along with your explanations for why you chose a particular answer or why you eliminated a particular answer. And I promise you, I will respond. Well, that's all for now. Until next time, happy learning.